Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this kind of content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. That morning, as Henry Prescott was making tea in his kitchen, the growl of bulldozer engines rumbled from the end of the street. Within a minute, the entire Rosewood Crest neighborhood was awakened by the sight of two massive bulldozers parked in front of Henry's home. The engines were still running when Clara Whitmore, HOA president, stepped out in her pale pink suit, clutching her signature rulebook. She pointed directly at the wheelchair ramp along the side of Henry's house. According to Section 12.4 of the HOA Handbook, Clara declared, external structures such as ramps and railings must be pre-approved before construction. Henry stepped outside, calm and composed. Ms. Whitmore, I have full permits from the city's planning department. That ramp is essential for my sister's mobility. You are infringing on her basic rights as a disabled person. Remove it now, Clara barked. The construction workers hesitated, but her command was clear. Henry, still composed, activated his home security cameras, placed a call to a journalist friend, and most importantly, contacted the Department of Land and Resources, where he had once served as a federal judge. Within 30 minutes, 2 police cruisers and a federal resource vehicle arrived on the scene. Clara bristled, but the department officials presented documentation showing the ramp had been lawfully approved and fell outside the HOA's authority. It wasn't until the officer read aloud, Ms. Clara Whitmore, if you proceed with demolishing this legal structure, we will be forced to file a report for property violation and obstruction under Section 7.6 of the Americans with Disabilities Act ADA. That she finally froze. What Clara hadn't expected was that the neighbors had already begun recording. Students, seniors, young families all started sharing videos online. A quiet uprising had begun, sparked by one threatened wheelchair ramp. Standing in the front yard, sunlight filtering through the trees of his childhood home, Henry looked straight at Clara. His voice as steady as it had been in countless courtrooms. Ms. Whitmore, you're on the verge of the biggest mistake of your life. But to salvage the dignity of this HOA, you only need to do one thing, step back. She didn't step back, so Henry took the next step forward. The law doesn't belong to the loudest voice. Henry Prescott stood tall in the middle of the street, a thick folder of legal documents in hand. Sunlight streamed through the tree canopy, casting shadows across the well-worn blazer he'd once worn in federal court. Across from him stood Clara Whitmore, pale-faced, clutching her pink notepad like a shield, surrounded by smartphones, news cameras, and the watchful eyes of the entire neighborhood. This is permit number 9872, issued by the city planning department, Henry said, his voice firm and deliberate, each word landing like a gavel strike. This one is a signed confirmation from the Office for Disability Access, under Section 12182 of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this, he held up the third document, is a civil complaint for unlawful destruction of property, discrimination against a disabled person, and obstruction of legal access. Clara opened her mouth, trying to object, but the wail of an ambulance pulling into the street cut her off. The back doors swung open. Margaret, Henry's sister, was being brought home from her checkup, only to see her carefully constructed wheelchair ramp reduced to rubble. She sat silently in her chair, expression unreadable, but the sadness in her eyes said enough. She was a teacher, Henry said softly, gesturing to Margaret. She taught the first children to grow up in this neighborhood. And today, this neighborhood denied her a way into her own home. Clara's lip trembled. I was just following the guidelines, maintaining standards. No one stands above the law, Henry replied. And today you didn't just tear down a ramp. You tore down respect, dignity, and compassion. For what? Neighborhood aesthetics. At that moment, a well-dressed man stepped from the crowd, flashing credentials to the reporters. I'm Richard Elmhurst from the State Attorney General's office, he announced. We are opening a formal investigation into the Rosewood Crest HOA, specifically Chairwoman Clara Whitmore, for potential civil rights violations. Clara stumbled back a step. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters shouted questions. A child from next door stepped forward and gently took Margaret's hand. "I'm sorry about your ramp," the girl whispered. And that was the moment everything changed. A retired judge, a disabled teacher, a child's small voice, and a broken ramp. But from that destruction, something greater began to rise. Henry turned to the sheriff. "I'm filing an emergency injunction and requesting the immediate suspension of the current HOA board pending investigation." The sheriff nodded. "We'll support that request fully, Judge Prescott." Then, one by one, the neighbors stepped forward. The Hartleys, fined for flying an American flag too long. Rachel, the single mom whose kids' toys were called an eyesore. Mr. Simmons warned over his aging golden retriever. They stood beside Henry, not shouting, not accusing, but united. Clara slowly removed her name tag. She said nothing, and then she turned and walked away, leaving behind the bulldozers, the broken concrete, and her crumbling authority. And just like that, without a gun fired or a harsh word shouted, Rosewood Crest began a new chapter. Henry stepped beside Margaret and gently took her hand. "We'll rebuild, Margaret," he said. "And this time, the whole community will build it together. The residents awaken, the truth comes to light." Under the soft golden light of late afternoon, Henry Prescott's front yard was no longer just the scene of a federal law violation. It had become the heart of a community awakening. The once silent neighbors were now finding their voices. One by one, they began sharing stories that had been buried for years under fear and pressure. Mr. Walter Green, a Marine Corps veteran, stood up with the help of his cane. His voice was deep, but clear. "3 years ago, my wife Ellen started having trouble with her grip from Parkinson's. I installed a small handrail by our front steps so she wouldn't fall. The next week, I got a $250 fine and a threat of legal action for unauthorized modifications." He paused, gripping his cane tighter, eyes locked on Clara. From the right side of the yard, a young woman named Amanda stepped forward, holding the hand of her little boy. He hid behind her skirt, large noise-canceling headphones covering his ears. "My son is autistic. We put up a therapy swing in our backyard. No one could see it, no one was bothered by it. But Clara sent us a notice, ordering it taken down within 10 days, calling it visually non-compliant. My son cried for a week." Each story cut through the crowd like a blade, peeling back layers of silence. Rosewood Crest wasn't a neighborhood. It was a prison with beige paint, white gravel, and a warden named Clara Whitmore. Henry stood silently, clutching his folder of documents. His eyes welled up. He'd seen injustice in countless courtrooms. But witnessing his neighbors, some who once avoided him at community picnics, now standing up for each other, left him nearly speechless. An elderly man with a thin frame and snow-white hair stepped forward. "I'm Joseph, the previous owner of house number 12, he said. "I was an electrician. 3 years ago, Clara made me take down my solar-powered lights because she said they were too modern and didn't fit the landscape. I didn't have the strength to fight. My wife told me to sell the house just to have peace, and I did. I came back today because I don't want anyone else to go through that." The crowd murmured. Heads nodded. Some people wiped away tears. Every memory once buried was now being named out loud. Clara still stood there, frozen, pale. The photos, the videos, and now, these lived experiences were building the biggest case of her life, not in a courtroom but in the hearts of the people. Henry stepped onto his front steps and quietly opened a leather-bound notebook. "This is the first step," he said, "but it won't be the last." And he began to write, not just a lawsuit but a declaration, a promise that this would become a community where fear had no home. The HOA hearing. We're not silent anymore. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon, until every chair in the Rosewood Crest Community Center was filled. People stood in the hallway, peering through the glass doors, hanging on every word. No one wanted to miss this HOA meeting because today Clara Whitmore, the self-appointed president, would finally face the very community she had ruled like her personal kingdom. Henry Prescott entered to quiet applause, not because he was a former federal judge, but because he was the first to stand up and speak the truth. Following him were two of his former law students, Amanda and Darius, pulling a rolling suitcase full of documents. And right behind them came Mildred Reyes, 78, steadying herself with her cane, holding a brown envelope filled with financial reports. Clara was already seated at the front, wearing a crisp white suit as if she were running for office. But this time, no one moved aside for her. No more respectful glances. No more fear. On behalf of the residents of Rosewood Crest, Henry began, his voice calm and clear like in a courtroom. I request that this meeting be recorded, made public, and that all proceedings comply with state law. Something this HOA board has deliberately ignored for over 7 years. Clara let out a scoff. Mr. Prescott, this is a private meeting. You have no authority to speak for. We have the authority, came a firm voice from the back. It was Walter Green, a 76-year-old veteran. And tonight, we're using it. Darius opened the suitcase and pulled out thick stacks of printed documents. This is a financial audit of the HOA from 2016 to the present, Amanda said, locking eyes with Clara. Total expenditures, $768,241. Nearly $400,000 marked as community improvements, but no corresponding receipts or project records. Henry held up a sheet. Transfers from the HOA account to a company called Whitmore and Partners Landscaping, owned by your nephew. $46,000 to pave your backyard, $12,000 to improve your property frontage, which turns out to be your vacation home in San Diego. Clara stood abruptly, her voice trembling. I don't have to sit here and listen to these baseless accusations. You haven't held a single legal HOA election since 2017, Henry interrupted. You disenfranchised over 60 households by citing missing proxy votes. Yet you never sent legal notices or meeting invitations. A projector turned on, and a large screen showed the words. Homeowners removed from voting rights, 127 households. A hush fell over the room. My name is on there, said a young woman standing. I never received anything about an election. I asked why I was fined $150 for an uneven pine tree, said an older man. And I was threatened with legal action. Henry looked around the room, his gaze steady and warm. We used to be a peaceful community. Over time, we were isolated, scared. We thought we were alone. But today, we are not alone. Amanda held up another document. Under California Civil Code sections 5120 and 5145, residents can vote to dissolve the HOA board with a 2/3 majority of valid homeowner signatures. Darius opened a large envelope and spilled out over 200 signed forms. We've got them. 231 valid signatures. That's over 70% of the neighborhood. Clara sank back into her seat, her face pale. We move to dissolve the current HOA board immediately, Henry declared, and to hold a new election under independent oversight. A thunderous round of applause followed. Not tentative, not fearful. A weight had lifted. Clara tried to speak again, but her mic was muted by the AV technician. A teenager she once fined $50 for putting up birthday decorations for his sister. Today, he decided she no longer had the right to speak for them. Restoring the community. Days later, Clara Whitmore was officially charged with embezzlement, abuse of power, and violations of federal disability law. Allen, the HOA's former attorney, agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Henry, alongside a coalition of elderly residents, young families, and formerly silenced neighbors, began drafting a new community charter. There would be no more closed-door meetings, no more arbitrary fines for flower pots or lawn chairs. And on the very ground where Clara once tried to bulldoze a wheelchair ramp, they built a small garden. Under the shade of an old willow, a carved wooden sign was placed. From justice to community. Henry stood quietly beside it, a warm cup of tea in his hand, not smiling because he'd won, but because Rosewood Crest had finally found its way home. The rebirth of Rosewood, a promise on the lawn. The first morning after the residents' assembly, Henry woke up early as usual, brewed a pot of mint tea, and opened his window to let in the morning sun. But this time, There were no bulldozers rumbling down the street, no workers acting on Clara's orders. Instead, there were the joyful sounds of children. Kids who had once been forbidden to draw with chalk on the sidewalks, now sketching sunflowers, rainbows, and even a brightly painted wheelchair ramp across the pavement. Henry stepped outside, holding a binder labeled, "The Right to Live Freely at Home Act." The people of Rosewood had awakened, and now they were ready to rebuild, from the wreckage Clara had left behind, with trust, compassion, and shared purpose. That evening, the first true community gathering under the Temporary Leadership Council took place on the shared lawn, a space once deemed restricted for unauthorized gatherings under Clara's rule. Dozens of folding chairs were set up. Mildred, Walter Green, the Porters, and their autistic son. All were there. Strings of warm lights lit the green field, welcoming what felt like a new spring for the neighborhood. Henry stood in the center, voice steady, eyes kind. "We've lived in fear, but all of you, each person here, proved that unity can break oppression. I present to you the first draft of the Right to Live Freely at Home Act." Slides of the proposed charter appeared on the large screen. No more fines for garden benches, handrails, or vegetable beds. No more vague rules or closed-door meetings. Every resident would have an equal vote. Clear protections for seniors, the disabled, and families were written. Plainly, no loopholes, no ambiguity. No one will be threatened over wind chimes. No one will be ordered to remove a wheelchair ramp for aesthetic reasons. And no one will ever again stand above the law just because they've held power longer, Henry said, his voice emotional. Applause erupted. An elderly man whispered to his son, "I wish we had spoken up years ago." The new interim HOA board was elected on the spot. Walter representing veterans, Mrs. Porter overseeing special needs support, and Dr. Anya, a Ukrainian immigrant, leading community health services. Henry declined any official position. He only asked to serve as pro bono legal advisor. Clara's old HOA office, once full of violation notices, was transformed into the Rosewood Support Center, offering legal help, counseling, and workshops on citizens' rights. A once feared room now bore a simple wooden sign, "A place to be heard." Henry walked with his sister Judith past the newly rebuilt ramp, more beautiful than before. Mosaic tiles formed doves and flowers, all hand-painted by Rosewood children. At the base of the ramp was a bronze plaque that read, "Freedom does not come from power, but from the courage of those who were once silenced." A young girl ran up to Judith and hugged her. "I painted that dove," she beamed. Judith teared up and squeezed the little hand. But the story didn't stop there. The next day, Henry received a call from the state law school where he once taught. "Judge Prescott, we'd like you to lecture on Rosewood's HOA reform model as a landmark case." A local TV station arrived to film Rosewood Day of Freedom on the very lawn that hadn't seen an all-neighbor meal in over 20 years. Until now, no one had been fined for string lights that stayed up too long. In Clara's old rulebook, abandoned in her desk, a faint line of red ink was found on the last page. "If you let them think you're weak, they'll take everything back." But the people of Rosewood had learned. They were never weak. They had only needed someone to rise first, and they had risen together. Henry closed his front door that night, gazing out at the glowing lawn. He smiled, took a sip of tea, and whispered, "Clara was wrong. They didn't take everything back. They just reclaimed what was right. From outrage to hope, what we leave behind after the battle." The story of Judge Henry Prescott and the Rosewood Crest community is more than just a confrontation between one man and a corrupt HOA. It's a reminder of something simple, yet often forgotten in modern society. The right to live in peace and dignity within your own home. When Henry's sister's wheelchair ramp was bulldozed, it wasn't just a violation of ADA laws. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that unchecked power, even in the form of a neighborhood board, can become a real threat when it's allowed to operate without transparency or compassion. But what makes this story remarkable isn't the injustice. It's how the community chose to respond. From initial outrage, something powerful began to grow. Neighbors who had been silent for years stepped forward. Not just for Henry, but for themselves, for the elderly couple who needed handrails, for the children with special needs who wanted a swing set, for the veterans who just wanted peace. Fear gave way to solidarity. Anger became resolved, and silence turned into a chorus of voices demanding change. The ramp was rebuilt, stronger, more beautiful, and painted by local school children with the message, "We walk together." The same bulldozing company that had been part of the destruction returned, not with machines, but with an apology and a scholarship fund in Henry's name to support students studying community justice. Today, while other neighborhoods still struggle with rules and fines and arbitrary power, Rosewood Crest stands as a model. Not because it's perfect, but because it learned. It grew. The old violations office is now a community wellness center. Neighbors look out for each other, not spy on one another. People decorate freely, garden proudly, and children laugh without fear of being too loud. This story made it into school textbooks, not because it was sensational, but because it was transformative. It teaches us that in a nation built on rights and freedoms, no one, not even an HOA president, is above the law. And that change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes, it begins with one man standing in his front yard, saying enough. In the end, it wasn't about a ramp. It was about reclaiming the community, about leaving behind something better, and about the enduring truth that when good people stand together, they can turn even the smallest act of defiance into a legacy of hope. Thank you for joining us on this journey. See you in the next story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories. HOA bulldozed my sister's wheelchair ramp, not knowing she's a feared state governor. HOA destroyed an accessible ramp, then discovered they messed with the governor. HOA thought they could intimidate my sister, until they realized she runs the state. HOA crossed the wrong woman. She's the governor, and she's coming for them. HOA bulldozed a wheelchair ramp, unaware they just declared war on the governor. In this explosive episode of HOA Tales, a heartless HOA crosses the line when they bulldoze a legally approved wheelchair ramp, without warning. What they didn't realize: the ramp belonged to the sister of a sitting state governor known for her no-nonsense approach and relentless pursuit of justice. This chapter of HOA Tales shows what happens when unchecked power meets someone who actually writes the laws. As HOA board members bragged about maintaining standards, they had no clue they were about to go head-to-head with one of the most feared figures in state politics. In true HOA Tales fashion, the tables turn fast and hard. What started as bullying quickly turns into a full-blown state investigation, with the governor herself stepping in to expose the HOA's long trail of abuse. This edition of HOA Tales is more than just another petty HOA dispute. It's a lesson in power, justice, and standing up for the vulnerable. When you mess with family, especially one in office, you'd better be ready for consequences. Don't miss this unforgettable HOA Tales story, where one illegal ramp demolition sparks a political firestorm the HOA never saw coming. Thank you for joining us on this journey. See you in the next story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories.